Okay, so we're going to go over in this video how to place brackets on the teeth. This is going to be geared more toward the dental assistant, so kind of a rough how to put the brackets on so that the doctor can then come over and finalize the position. But all of the information in this video, if you want a really in-depth version of how to place brackets perfectly, I would highly recommend the book Smart Clip, Self-Ligating Appliance System by Hugo Trevisi. And there's a chapter in there on how to place brackets accurately, and it is the best summary I've ever read. I've used that system for years and it's been amazing, works awesome. So generally the patient will be upside down like this in the chair, so that's how we're going to look at these while we're placing them. Usually the doctor will place the 7 and the 6, and then usually the 5 and the 4. So we'll go over quickly how to place those. So the 6 on upper and lower, you'll see it has a groove right here. There's a groove in these American orthodontic brackets that sits right in there, and then you want the top of the base of the bracket to be parallel to an imaginary line that connects the mesial and distal marginal ridges right here. So this is pretty good bracket placement on this dentiform. This is not totally parallel. I would raise the mesial up just a hair, but you get the idea. And about 1 millimeter from the edge-ish, roughly. So then premolars, you'll notice when you look at a premolar, it'll have kind of a swell to it, or like a height of contour as it's called. Think of it like the back of a horse, and then you want this to set like a saddle right straddling or centered on that height of contour. That's rotation. This one is great. This one is a little bit too far to the mesial. It should go back around. The idea is you want the slot of this bracket to be parallel with a line that is running across the occlusal table right here, so that all of these teeth end up being in a nice continuous arc. So then rotationally, you want it centering that height of contour. Then you look at it from the facial surface, and you want an imaginary line running down that height of contour on the permanent tooth to be the bracket to be parallel to that, or the slot to be perfectly perpendicular. So the way that I visualize this is I imagine a line across the mesial and distal marginal ridges, and then I set this slot parallel to those, or to that imaginary line. So that's premolars. Canines, on the upper and lower, they have a height of contour as well. You'll see kind of a swell here. You want the canines to be just maybe 0.5 millimeter to the mesial of that height of contour. This bracket is just slightly distal to that height of contour. I would rotate this around just a hair so that the center of that bracket was just mesial to that height of contour. And then you'll visualize a line that goes straight down the long axis of the tooth. What I mean by the long axis is, picture if the root was here and you drew a line that went straight down that crown and then straight down the root, that's the long axis, and you want this to be parallel to that. And the height right here, so the height of these premolars, you want to kind of look down the barrel of that 6, the tube on that, and you want these 4s and 5s to be lined up with that if the marginal ridges are level. If the marginal ridges are off, you want them to be high or low to that imaginary line connecting these slots. So if this one was a 1 millimeter high, you would want that bracket slot to be 1 millimeter high to that imaginary line, if that makes sense. So then the height on these, on the canine, I would place on the upper, from measuring from the base of the bracket right here to the incisal edge right up here, I like that to be just at the top of that 2 millimeter mark on the perioprep. This one is at about 3 millimeters, which is a fine position, but for me personally, I like it just at the top of that 2 millimeter mark. Same thing here on the lateral, except I like it to be about 1.5 millimeters, and then the ones at about the bottom of that 2 millimeter mark. And then on the uppers, rotationally, you'll be looking at them like this. You want a line that connects the incisal edge right along there. You want that slot to be parallel to that line of the incisal edge. And rotationally, this way, you want, again, for it to be parallel to the long axis of that tooth. Do not look at the incisal edge and set it perpendicular to this incisal edge, because most people have wear and tear or different shape anomalies on the edges of the teeth, so their edge could be like this, like at that angle, which is not perpendicular to the long axis of the tooth. So when we're done, I'll polish that down nice and level. So always look at the long axis of the tooth, and the way you visualize that is these two sides right here. So you'll picture a line that kind of bisects those. If it's perfectly rectangular, the line will be parallel to these. Usually it's more kind of triangular, and you just picture a line that goes straight down the middle, like that. And then same thing here. On the centrals, I usually set it roughly parallel to this, to the side of the tooth. If I'm looking like roughly right about there would be the long axis. So that's on the upper. On the lower, the doctor will set the 6s and 7s on there, and then on the 4s and 5s, you'll set it on the height of contour right there, and then parallel to this line that connects the mesial and marginal ridge, with the exception of the lower 4s. The mesial marginal ridge is lower than, if you connect the line, it won't be perpendicular to the long axis. So just put it roughly on that height of contour, and you'll have what'll look like a little bit of tip on it, like this, to get that root to upright correctly. On the lower 3s, you'll set them just slightly to the mesial of the height of contour. This one's not too shabby as far as rotation goes. And parallel to the long axis. This one is tipped to exaggerate like this. You would want it parallel to that long axis, would be right about there. Height-wise, I set from the edge of this bracket, the base of the bracket, to the incisal edge, about 3 millimeters. So I'll measure like this. From the bottom of that large black line, and then I'll eyeball about 3 millimeters. So this one's not too far off. So I'll look at it kind of like that. Then these lower incisors, again, you'll set them parallel so that the slot is parallel to the edge of the tooth, okay? And then you'll take a look at them, you'll set them parallel to the long axis of the tooth. This one is terrible. You'll see the long axis of the tooth is like this, and that bracket slot is probably 5 or 10 degrees off. So that'll cause this root to tip distally like that, which you don't want. This one's looking pretty good. This one is terrible as well. The long axis of this tooth is kind of here-ish, and you'll see how that one again is 5 or 10 degrees off. So you would set this bracket more like that, whereas right now it's kind of like this. And then same thing, oh, and these are maybe roughly 2 millimeters from the edge of the tooth. So height-wise, on the upper 3s, it goes top of the 2 millimeter line, 1.5, bottom of the 2 millimeter line. On the lowers, it goes on the canines 3 millimeters, and on all the incisors about 2 millimeters, roughly. And then the doctor, don't cure anything, the doctor will come and perfect the positioning as best they're able. Okay, so for actually placing these brackets, I'm going to take you through kind of the sequence and how you will check the position of the brackets as you're positioning them. We're going to pretend like this dentiform doesn't have any brackets on it, and we're going to place the brackets. So you get your bracket in your little bracket holder and you set it on there. The premolars are both very similar. You'll set it on there, you'll kind of take a look at it and eyeball where it should be, and then you'll position it about where you think it should be with your scaler or your Explorer, and then you'll take a look at it from the buccal in this mirror, and you want to check that the slot where the wire goes is parallel to the imaginary line connecting the two marginal ridges. That sets your tip. So this way, your tip. And then you'll take a look from the occlusal to check your rotation. So you look at it from the occlusal with the mirror to make sure that that bracket is straddling that height of contour in the middle. And then you kind of eyeball it from the slot on the 6, which isn't present, but you would kind of basically get an idea of where it should be. Now once it's where you want it to be, you press down right here in the center, and that seats it into place and the extra glue squishes out. Then this is the most important step. You go around and just kind of, with your tip of your Explorer in contact with the tooth, and you scrape off the extra glue, wipe it on your glove or whatever. You just get all of that out. While you do that, you're gonna move it. And so then you reposition it basically back to where it should be. Then you recheck from the buckle to check your tip. Check from the occlusal to make sure your rotation is still good, and then you move on to the next one. The canine, you place on there. Again, you'll eyeball it, you'll take a look at it, just have them turn and you'll look at the tooth, and you're kind of making sure that it's parallel to the long axis of the tooth. Make sure that the center of the bracket is just to the mesial of the height of contour. And make sure that your tip is good, and then you seat it into place by pushing on the center of the bracket. Clean up your flash, and then you check from the occlusal like this, and then make sure that your tip is good by looking straight at it. Make sure it's pressed into place, all the flash is cleaned up. Then you go on to the 2. You put the 2 on, get your height right after you position it, or after you set it on there. You'll get your tip about what you think it should be, and then these, you can't really look down the edge with your eyes, so what you'll do is you'll check them in your mirror like this. And you want to make sure that the slot of that bracket is parallel to the incisal edge. And then you'll check the height of the canine like this. From the bottom of this dark black line right here, I'll set that right on the edge of the top of the bracket, and then I want about 3 millimeters to the edge of the tooth. So I'll set it like this. And then these should be about 2 roughly, and you'll measure them in the same way. So about 2 millimeters from the edge. You'll check rotation by looking down the incisal edge like this. You'll check tip by looking at the sides of the tooth and kind of getting a sense for where the long axis of that tooth is. And then you go on to the next one. You do that with each of these, and so you'll position 3 to 3 usually for the doctor. And if the tooth is crooked, you're still looking at the same things. It's by individual tooth. So just make sure that that slot is parallel to the incisal edge of the tooth. Make sure that your bracket is parallel to the long axis of the tooth, and that it's about 2 millimeters away from the edge. And then you seat it into place. You clean up your flash. Make sure that it's seated back in if you moved it when you're cleaning a flash, and then you go on to the next one. So then you get those positioned 3 to 3. The doctor will come and perfect the position as best they're able, and then cure it into place. The uppers are very similar, except now the patient's bottom jaw has fallen off, so we'll just set that aside. Hopefully they don't forget it like they do their coat oftentimes. So then the top brackets are the same. You'll place the 4s and 5s. You'll check it by looking in the mirror to check for rotation. You want it straddling that height of contour. You'll check it from the buckle like this to make sure that the slot is parallel to the imaginary line connecting the distal and mesial marginal ridges. And then you move on to the 3. You'll position the 3. You'll check it from the occlusal to check the rotational position of it. And on these, you want the height. I'll measure the height of these like this. You want the height generally to be about at the top of the 2 millimeter mark, which this one is pretty darn close. That's about where you want it height-wise. And make sure that it's parallel to the long axis of the tooth. And then you go on to your 2, you place that, you kind of eyeball it so it's about in the middle of the tooth. It looks like it's about 1.5 millimeters from the edge. Squish it into place by pressing on the center, clean up your flash. Look from the incisal edge to make sure that it's rotationally correct. The slot of the bracket, or the wire slot, is parallel to the edge of the tooth. And then you look at it with your eyes to make sure that that's parallel to the long axis of the tooth. And then you measure from the edge of the bracket to the edge of the tooth. This one is at about the underside of the 2. I'd move it up so it was about to there, at about 1.5-ish. And then you move on to the 1s, position it, eyeball it, so you're getting it about where you want it to be, seated into place, clean up your flash, look from the incisal edge to make sure that that slot is parallel to the long axis, or pardon me, the incisal edge of the tooth. And then you look with your eyes to make sure that it's parallel to the long axis of the tooth. The way you adjust that is you'll just take your scaler and you just tap right here. If you want it to rotate like this, you can either tap here. If you want it to come to the mesial, you'll tap this corner and that'll pivot it around. Or you can tap this upper corner if you need the bracket to move that way a little bit in addition to rotating. So I'll give it a little tap tap until it looks about right, and then I'll measure it. That's about right where I like those to be, roughly. So about the underside of that 2 millimeter mark. And then you make sure you push it into place, make sure all your flash is cleaned up, and then you go on. And you just do that for all the 3 to 3, and then the doctor will come and check.